Today's daf is daf Yud Gimel. We're going to start on daf Yud Beis, Amud Beis, on the bottom of the Amud. And by way of takeoff, so to speak, we'll mention the Shita of Rava, because that's gonna come up here. And Rava said that what you're permitted to do on Yontif is called Molalin Malilos. And Molalin Malilos, according to the Rav Shulchan Aruch, means that he takes the shibolim in his palms, the palms of his hand, and he rubs his hands back and forth until he removes the outer kernel. And you're allowed to do that on Yontif. And even though normally that would be considered Disha, which is one of the malachas, but nevertheless he does it kalachar yad, he's doing it in a very unusual way, so that even on Shabbos it would only be d'Rabbanan, and on Yontif there was no Gzeres Chacham. Now we're going to start Imkein Matzinu Truma Shezakai Baharamasa, which is 1.5 lines before the end of Yud Beis, Amud Beis. What this means is that according to Rava, once you're allowed to do this Malilos business that we described on Yontif, then you should be able to be mafresh. 1 second, let me just press the mute button here. Okay. You should be able to be mafresh Trumos and Maestros on Yontif. Why? Because if we're allowing you to do this Molel Malilos, then at that moment you become Chayiv and Afrosha. And of course, the whole reason that we're allowing you to do this Malilos business, this Disha Kalachiyad, is so that you could eat it. Well, you can't eat it unless you're Mafresh Trumos and Maestros. Usnan. And yet our Mishnah says in Beis Hillel's response to Beit Shammai, Lo im amartem betruma she'ena zakai b'haramasa b'yontif. Meaning that there's no truma whatsoever that you're allowed to be mafresh on yontif. But according to the sheet of Rava, that molal and malilos b'yontif, then it seems that you can, and you're obligated to be mafresh trumas on yontif. Well, it says lo kasha, and here we turn to Daf Yud Gimel. To Ha, that which we said according to Rava, that there is truma that you mafresh on Yontif, that's only Rebbe. That's only according to the sheet of Rebbe, who holds, as we'll see soon see in the Beitza, that once you make your chitin, your kernels of grain, edible by this process of molal and molilos, then you chal the chiyuv hafresh. You have to be mafresh trumas and maestros. Vaha, but our Mishnah that says that there's no such thing as hafreshas trumas and maestros on Yontif, that reflects the shita that argues against Rebbe, which is the shita of Rebbe Yossi b'Rebbe Yehuda, and he holds that chitin, when you prepare the chitin through this molal and molilos process, in which you rub your hands together in order to remove the kernel, they are part of me truma. So therefore comes out, according to Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, that there's no possibility of being mafresh trumas and maestros on Yontif. Because in the case of molal malilos, which Rava permits on Yontif, it would not be, according to Rabbi Yossi, any chiv trumas and maestros. The Sanya, we learned in a Beitza, ichnis shibolin. Okay, let me just give a little bit of background, because today's sugya and daf is all about truma. So in the laws of truma, we have to know that we have what's called tvuas dagan, which are the 5 species of grains, and they require what's called gmar malacha. And gmar malacha means that we do what's called winnowing, and we remove the chaff, and then we do what's called knisa labais. We take it into the house. So the Gemar Malacha in the case of Tvua is called Meruach. Meruach means winnowing. And then after that, when he winnows all of his tvua, then he piles it together in a neat stack, which is called kri, chaf reish yud. And then when he takes it into his house, he's chayav in Trumas Maasros. Now, if he wants to eat before Gemar Malacha, when it's still in a pretty much a natural state, then he's allowed to do so what's called achilas aroi. Achilas aroi means he does it in an unusual way. Like, for example, he plucks one kernel at a time and he puts it into his mouth. That's called achilas aroi. So now we're learning the Beitza here on the top of Yud Gimel. Ichnis shibolim. He's got tvua, and it has the klipa on top of it. And he takes it into his house for the purpose of grinding it. That's called tchina or ktisha. Vilasos mem isa. He's going to make a flour and then add water and make a dough. But he hasn't done Gemar Malacha because he didn't do the winnowing. It's still im klipasa. Is ochel man arai upot. He's allowed to eat on a kind of a haphazard way, and he's part of Trumas and Maasros. And that's because there was no Gemar Malacha, and before Gemar Malacha, you're allowed to eat achilas aroi without afrosha of truma. Now, the Beitza goes on to ask our question. What about molin malilos? If he takes the kernels of grains and he rubs them together in the palms of his hand to remove the chaff. So the Beitza records a machlokus about whether he's chayav in Trumas or Maasros. Rebbe mechayev. Rebbe says that in Tvuas Dagon, your intention is to winnow the tvua and then create a kri. But in the case where he indicates that his intention is only molol malilos, he has no intention to do the kri, so he doesn't need another gemar malacha to winnow and remove the chaff. He's doing it by hand, and that replaces your normal gemar malacha. So you have two categories, so to speak, of gemar malacha. You have classic gemar malacha in Tvuas Dagon, which is the meruach, and then you make a kri out of it. And then you have a very specific gemar malacha for the case of molin malilos, where he takes his grains and he does this molin malilos process. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda poter, and Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda understood from the pasuk that says reishes degancha, and the word degancha means dagon, and that means that we need tvuas dagon. Dagon is, if you translate the word dagon, dagon means the tvuah is collected into a kri, into this stalk, into this haystack, so to speak, kernel stack of grains. And that's when you have Gemar Malacha. And here, his intention is completely to circumvent kri. He's not going through this whole process, and therefore, there's no Gemar Malacha. It's not reishis begancha. So if you ask me to sort of reduce the machlokus between Rebbe and Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda to its nitty gritty basics, I would say that the machlokus is the following. Whereas Rebbe understands Gemar Malacha in a conceptual way, Rabbi Yossi understood Gemar Malacha in an absolute way. And therefore, Rebbe will allow for flexibility that in certain cases you indicate that you're not interested in the normal step-by-step methodology of Gemar Malacha. You have a different Gemar Malacha, and that also generates a fee of Trumas and Maasros. But Rabbi Yossi derived from the pasuk Degancha that there's an absolute. It's got to be the normal way you would take Tvua Zaracha and make it into Dagon, which means after the Meruach, you make it into a Kri. In Molin Malilos, where you circumvent that entire process, Rabbi Yossi says you're part from Trumas and Maasros. The Gemara now asks, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Nami Mishkachas Lo. So you're telling me that our Mishnah, which says that there's no such thing as Hafrashas Trumas and Maasros on Yontif reflects the sheet of Rabbi Yossi. I'm going to show you that there is a case where even Rabbi Yossi would agree that you're chayav in Trumas and Maasros on Yontif. How so? When he brought in his shibolim, which means his kernels of grains in their natural state, into the house, his intention was to go through the entire process, the normal process of making an Isa. And then he changed his mind, the Molalon. And now he's going to do this strange process in a manual kind of winnowing. And all this was a decision on Yontif. So on Erev Yontif, he prepared these kernels, and on Yontif, he decided, instead of making it into an Isa and going through that whole process, after he had already brought it into the house, he decided, I'm going to change my mind, I'm going to do Malilos. And therefore, the Tavla Biyome, at the very moment that he had decided in his original decision to create an Isa, at that moment, he became Chayav in Trumas and Maasros. The fact that later on, he changed his mind, and he's not going to make Kri, but rather he's going to bring this Tvua into his house and do Belilos. It doesn't matter. Why? Because the Torah's Hafroshas Trumas and Maasros was Chal already mitchila when he brought it in with the intention of making a Kri. So his intention when he took it in already sets in stone a Chiyuv Trumas and Maasros. And even though at the end of the day he didn't do the Kri, he already became Chayiv in Trumas and Maasros. Whenever he brought it into the house, that was his Gmar Malacha. And now when he changes his mind that he wants to be Molalos, he's still Chayiv in Trumas and Maasros. So even Rabbi Yossi will have a scenario in which you're Chayiv in Trumas and Maasros on Yontif, because according to Rava, you're allowed to do the Malilos on Yontif. As we said before, it's Disha Kalachar Yad, and they were Matin on Yontif, and he's now Chayiv in Trumas and Maasros. Ella, says the Gemara, you know what? We have to go back to our Mishnah. What does the Mishnah mean when it says Truma? You're not allowed to be Mafresh Truma on Yontif. Rov Truma. In most cases, you're not Chayiv to be Mafresh on Yontif. Why? Because he was already Chayiv in Trumas and Maasros on Erev Yontif, and we don't allow him to do the Disha on Yontif, and therefore, in most cases, you're not going to find a Chiv Trumas and Maasros on Yontif. It's only in that very rare case of Tfuah Nachelas Al Yidei Malilos, which is only a miut katan of cases, that's when you'll be Chayav in Trumas and Maasros. So therefore, our Mishnah has nothing to do with the Isur of Holachas Truma, right? You cannot derive from our Mishnah that there's an Isur of Holachas Truma, because Truma is a non-entity on Yontif. You're not allowed to be Mafresh Truma, and therefore you're not allowed to be Molech Truma to the Kohen, and hence we have a complete consent, according to one lishon at least of both Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai, that we are not allowed to be Molech Truma to a Kohen on Yontif. By the way, on the side, I just want to mention that Rashi has a very unique shita here. According to Rabbi Yossi, you remember that Rabbi Yossi in the Beitza was of the opinion that Ichnisan Chibolim Limolalan B'Melios Patur, and Rashi holds you're allowed to eat even an Achilas Kema. In other words, there's no Chiv Trumas and Maasros at all. Omar Abaye, this machlokas between Rebbe and Rabbi Yossi is B'Shibolim, only applies to Tuas Dagon. And that's where Rabbi Yossi says you're Patur in the case of Ichnisan Limolalan Melilos, you're Patur from Truma. Why? Because since In the case of Shibolim, of Tuas Dagon, it's Omed Lidisha. Therefore, he must have Meruach and Kri. Aval Bekitios and Midrabanan Yechayev and Shuvas and Maisos, even on legumes. Then, with regard to legumes, it's quite common that you don't do Meruach and you don't remove the klipos of the legumes. And therefore, Bekitios, where he took them in to his house, and they're still covered by the, we'll call it a stalk or a stem, is Divrei HaKol, everybody agrees, that Usuraisa Tavla. Now, the word Isuraisa is an Aramaic, it's actually based on a Hebrew word, but it means kshuros. Asuros means kshuros, they're tied together. And they're tied together in bundles, and the bundles are surrounding you. When you bind it, you surround what's called the sharvit, the outer covering, the stalk or the stem. And in that case, is tavla. Tavla means that you're chayav in Trumas and Maisros. And Abai says that even Rabbi Yossi would agree that in this case you're chayav in Trumas and Maisros, because there are many people that will not beat down the sharvit of the kidneys and remove the sharvitim, those coverings, in order to make a kri, but rather they do a chavit only on a small, limited amount of the legumes, and the rest they take in these chavilos, in these tied up bundles, where they are tied up around the sharvitim, around the outer covering of the legumes. So therefore, in the case of chavilos, of kidneys, which still have the sharvitim on it, everybody says Abai would agree that's called Gemar Malacha, that's normal, that's classic, they don't do the chavata, and therefore he's chayiv in Trumas and Maisros. Lema Misayele, can we quote a Mishnah in the 10th parak of Trumas to prove Abaye's Shita? Isha Hayulo Chavile Tilson. Tilson is a one category, one specific species of legumes. And what you do with Tilson is that you add a little bit at a time to a kedera, to a pot, and it adds taste. Shel Tevel, and he wasn't mafresh Trumas and Maisros. Hareze Kotesh. The Mishnah says that what he's going to do with these legumes is he's going to separate the zera. The zera is the legume itself that you eat, from the sharvit, from its outer chaff, and calculate how much zera you have. Why? Because when you give truma, usually give 2% or 1/40 if you have an ayin tova, ayin yofa, or 1/60 if you have an ayin ra. So you try to shots up how much zera you have, but eino mafresh ala eitz. That sort of hard part that we call a sharvit, that covers, or otherwise known as giv'ol, if you're familiar with that word, even though it has a taste, and very often you add it to the kedera, but nevertheless, it's not called an ochel, and it doesn't generate a chi of Trumas and Maisros. In the laws of Trumas and Maisros, to qualify for the chi of Truma and the Isa Tevel, you need what's called an ochel bifnei atzmon, something that can be eaten and is normally eaten on its own. But something that is not eaten on its own, it's not edible. You just add it to the tavshil to add and enhance the taste, because it's what we call a tam etzo ketam pirio. It has the taste of the legume itself, but it's not eaten by itself, and therefore it's not chayev in Trumas and Maisros. Anyway, we see clearly from this Mishnah at Chavile Tolson, meaning when it's still tied together in its original stuff, it should be mafresh Trumas and Maisros. My love, and yet it would seem that this Mishnah is Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehudi. Again, it's not clear at this point in the Gemara why the Gemara insists that the author of this Mishnah is Rabbi Yossi. That we'll get to a little bit later. The Omar Hassam, and it was Rabbi Yossi who said earlier, quoted in the Beitza, that Hichnis Shibalim is patur. And yet here, right, in Hassam and Shibalim lo tavla, he's patur from Trumas and Masechet. Here in the case of Tilson, tavla, he's chayav in Trumas and Masechet. Again, how do you pronounce it? Tilson. Okay, Tilson. I wanted to pronounce it correct. Is tavla. So this can only be understood according to Abaye, that there's a difference between Shibolim, which is Tvuas Dagon, and Kitnios. In the case of Kitnios, this is considered Gemar Malacha, because again, many people, as we said before, don't do the Chavata to remove the Sharvit. And if that be the case, we really prove Abaye's point that in Kitnius, everybody, even Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda admits that Asuraisa Tavla, that even while it's still tied together around the Shibolim, around the Sharvitim, nevertheless, these Kitnius are Chayiv and Trumas and Meisers. Gemara says, "Lo, you can't prove anything from this Mishnah. Rebbe, this Mishnah reflects the sheet of Rebbe, and Rebbe was the one who says that in Tvua you can be Chayiv and Trumas and Meisers even if you do Melila. Your intention was for Molalos, but according to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Kitnios would never be Chayiv and Trumas and Meisers because he brought it in Chavilos, meaning when it's still in the Sharvit. And that's not called Gemar Malacha. And you remember that Rabbi Yossi was the one who had an absolute requirement of Gemar Malacha. So Gemara says, Rebbe, are you telling me that this Mishnah is authored by Rebbe? My Irya Tilson. Why does the Tana focus our attention specifically on Tilson? By the way, is Mendel there? Oh, I
don't see him. He's not with us.
Oh, I see. Okay, he's not with us.
I did tell him so.
All right. But so why Tilson? Afilu Shibolim Nami. Even in the case of Tvua, according to Rebbe, if you have these chavilos and they're still inside the Sharvit, but his intention is Kedei L'Mololon, Rebbe's shita was he's chayiv in Trumas Samai. So why do you focus your attention here on Tilson when the same halach applies to Chavile Tvua if his intention was L'Mololon? Elamai. So then by process of elimination, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, our Mishnah here, the Mishnah in Trumas, reflects the shita of Rabbi Yossi. If that be the case, the Gemara asks the following question: Lishmeinon b'shar mine kitnios. There's a less of a chiddush in Tilson. It'd be a greater chiddush in kitnios in general. Why did he single out Kitni? Why does he single out Tilson? Because in the case of other kitnios, many people will separate the sharvit, the outer thing, and they make a kri. And then we would have figured out, had the Mishnah mentioned Kitnios and told me that you still chayiv in Truma, even bechavilot shel Kitnios, then Kolshkein Tilson. Because Tilson is, as a general rule, Ein Osim Mimenu Kri, Ela Notlim Mimenu Ma'at Matas Hazroim Masharvitim. That's usually a normal way. And the reason for that is because the Sharvit, as we said before, has a tam, and it enhances the flavor of the tavshil. Ella, says the Gemara, Tilson is trichle. There's a special chiddush in Tilson, and what's that? Salkatay Tramina Hol Vitama Eitzo Period Shove is Lifrosh Namia Eitzo, since the taste of the Sharvit is equal to the taste of the legume itself, the zera itself. Therefore, I would think that you chayav in Trumas and Maestros, even on the Sharvit, even on what's called the eights. Kamash Malan, the Mishnah wants to tell us no, that in Tilson, even though the Sharvit is used in the process of cooking, but nevertheless, you're not chayav in Trumas and Maestros from the Sharvit, because as we said before, it doesn't have a Shem Ochel, it's not eaten on its own. And this leads us to Ika Diamri. Now, the Ika Diamri, according to Rashi at least, has a totally different understanding of the Machlokes between Rebbe and Rabbi Yossi. So let's just summarize that, that what we clarified was that the Mishnah in Trumos, according to the first Lishna, before we get to the second Lishna, is telling me a special Chiddush in Tilson, that you don't have to be mafresh truma from Charvite Tilson. But it's not coming to teach me a chiddush that you chayav in afrosha from the Tilson itself, even though it's still bechavilos and you haven't removed the Charvitim. So therefore, we could say that this Mishnah is actually reflecting the sheet of Rebbe. And even in the case of Tfuah, that he came in to do the Melila, he's chayav in Shuvas and Maisrus. But Rabbi Yossi might actually hold that even in kidneys, you're not chayav in Shuvas and Maisrus. We don't know. There's no proof to Abaye from this Mishnah. Ika Diamri, Omar Abaye Machlokes Bishibolim. Actually, the Machlokes between Rebbe and Rabbi Yossi reviewed this in Tuas Dagon. And only in this case did Rebbe say that if you brought it in Kedei L'Mololon, then you're chayav in Truma, because many people do that, and they take it into the house, and they do this malilos, and also many people also have what's called klayos, which is similar to our cereals. They take, what are they called, brand cereals, these kinds of cereals in their natural form, and they bake it in an oven. So therefore, Rebbe holds that when you take it into the house, it's a gemar malach, and you chayv in Trumas Maisus. Aval Kitnius, Divrei Akol, Asuroisa, Lo Tovla, the exact opposite of the Lishna, Kama, Lo Tovla, they are not Tevel, you're not Chayav in Trumas and Maisrus in Kitnios when you still have the Sharvit and you tie it together in Chavilos. Why? Because, as we said before, we need Kumar Malach, we need Kri, and in most cases, even in Kitnios, they do Kri. And if, unless he decides on his own that he's not going to do Kri, then he's parted from Chuvas and Maisrus. Tosas, by the way, this Tosas Maschal Ika quotes the Sar Mikutzi. He doesn't like this Rashi at all because the Lishna Achrina is the exact opposite of the Lishna Kama. The Ika Diamre is polar opposite. We don't usually find that two Lishonos that go from one Kotzer to the other. Meisvei, the Gemara has a kash on this second version of Abaye from the Mishnah in Trumas that we learned before. Misha yulo chavile tilson shel tevel hareze kotesh mechashev kamazer yeshbem umafresh ala zera v'eno mafresh ala eitz. So you see that in the case of chavile tilson, you have to be mafresh truma, even though you haven't separated the zera from the sharvit. My love, shouldn't we say that when it says tevel, what it means is tevel tovel shel truma. That tilson becomes tevel gomur because you aren't mafresh truma. That's against Abaye in the Lishna Basra. Abaye says that everybody agrees that in Kitnios, when it's still in the Sharvit, you're not chayiv in Trumas and Maisros. Lo. Gemara says that the word tevel here does not refer to truma at all, but rather tevel tovel shel trumas maser. As you know, we're obligated to set on years 1, 2, 4, and 5 of the Shemitah cycle, separate 10% a tithe for the Levium. That's called Maser. And the Levi is chayav to give maser mina maser. He has to give to the Kohen 1/10 of what we gave him. So this tilson was maser that was given to the Levi, what we call maser rishon. And the Levi had not yet been mafresh trumas maser. Now you'll ask, well, wait a second. He didn't separate the zera from the sharvit. Right? We're talking about tilsa, chavile tilsa. And yet it says tevel, that he's chayiv in truma, meaning the Levi is chayiv in truma. Why is the Levi chayiv in truma? He didn't separate the zera from the sharvit. So Gemara says, Kid Rabbi Avo, the Omar, Rab Shimon Lakish, the Omar Rabbi Avo, Omar Rab Shimon ben Lakish, Maser Rishon, Shekdimo Bishi Boliv, Shmo Tovlo L'Trumas Maser. What happened is, the Levi took his Maser before the Yisrael, the owner of the Tfuah, had been mafresh Truma. In the Seder of Hafrashos, first, the Yisrael is mafresh Truma. So now he has only 98% of his Tfuah. And then he takes off 10%, we'll call it 9.8, from what's left after the Truma. In this case, Hikdimo B'Shibolim. Right? Hikdimo B'Shibolim means that before the Hafrashos Truma, the Levi came and collected his maser. And then we have a principle called shmo. Shmo means that once it's called maser, it has a special status, and automatically, maser, by definition, is chayiv in trumas maser, without gemar malach. So if I had to quiz you in the middle of the night, when do you have to give trumas of maisros without Gemar Malacha? Again, you might talk about Molim Alilos, according to Rebbe, but the answer to that question would be in Trumas Maser, where the Levi got his Maser before the Yisrael was Mafresh Truma. And in such a case, we're going to obligate the Levi to give Trumas Maser, even though there was no Gemar Malacha, there was no Kri. And that means, by the way, he's not allowed to eat even an achilas arot. So now the Gemara raises the following question. If the Mishnah is talking about Maser Rishon, Shelo Nitna Mimenu Truma, and Trumas Maser, is Kotesh Lomali. Why does the Mishnah say that he has to be Kotesh? He has to do this disha process and then give to the Kohen his due of Tolson after they separate the Zroim from the Sharvitim. Lemole, why can't the Levi say to the Kohen, Yehechi diyavu li, hachi yaviv nilcha. They gave me Maser from Zroim while they were still connected to the Sharvit, before they separated the two. That's what I want to give you as Trumas Maser. Why do I have to go through the whole bother, the tircha of Tikkun Atolson, before I give it to you? I got it from the Yisrael before this whole process of separating the Zroim from the Sharvitim, and that's how I'm going to give it to you as Trumas Maser. Amarava Knasa. That this is already a penalty that the Rabbanan established because the Levi came fast and prematurely took his Maser Rishon before Hafrashas Truma. Of course, the Levi gained something because instead of getting 9.8, he gets a full 10%. And in the note here, He writes, "Halevi garam liyisrael lavar al divrei Torah," that the Levi caused the Yisrael to violate the Torah law, quoting a Mishnah in the third parak of Trumos, "Damate ma'aserisha letruma over belotas," shenemar Meleoscha v'dimascha lo siacher, and the Gemara darshins Meleoscha elu bikurim dimascha elu truma, the Amar Torah lo tiacher. So this was a knas to impose a tircha on the Levi before he fulfills his mitzvah of trumas mas. Tanya nami hochi, we learned thusly in a braysim, and Levi shen nasnu lo ibolim b'masrosa. You know, it's before. He says, "Kodem shemafrish hu mehem trumas maser." Right. So the Israel gave shibolim as maser, and now oso sogoren, we're going to impose the tircha, the obligation, the responsibility on the shoulders of the Levi to separate the garinim from the chaff that covers them, the what we call the motes. And on novim, if let's say the Levi took on novim again before the Afrosh's truma, now the Levi's chayiv in trumas maser, oso som yayin. He's got to go through the whole tircha of creating wine from the grapes zeisim osam oshel shemen umafresh aleim trumas maser and osel kohen. And only after he does this whole tircha, then he will be able to fulfill his obligation of trumas maser to the kohen. Geshem truma gedola ena niteles elim min hagoren.